This week I want to spend some time thinking with you about competitive negotiation. Competitive negotiation is a fascinating process because it's so predictable. The process is predictable, the substance is predictable, and in many cases, even the outcome is predictable. Let's take a look at a couple of dynamics that you can go to the bank on that are just a part of almost every single one of these processes. Dynamics that if you can see and you can manage, you can use to deliver a better outcome. The first dynamic is that typically this process involves a fixed pool of resources. There's only so much value in a deal. There's only so much time to go around. And as a result of that, people tend to get competitive with one another as they seek to achieve as much as they possibly can. And so with that fixed pie, what happens is that it becomes a zero-sum exchange, which means that whatever one side wins, the other side must lose, and vice versa. The way that this process usually begins is that parties will take positions. They'll have their perspective on how that pool of value should be divided. Typically, that perspective tends to lean in their favor. And so it is with the other side as well, and that's what sets the stage for a very competitive style of bargaining. This style of bargaining is known as distributive bargaining because the conversation is about how do we distribute this pool of resources. Now we know that if there is going to be a deal, parties are going to have to make concessions. They're going to have to compromise their positions as they work towards each other to try to find some place in the middle that they can shake hands and do the deal. If there's no concessions or no compromise, there probably won't be a very good deal. Now what's so interesting is how this process sets up. It's very predictable, but how it plays out is also predictable. What we know is that the concessions are going to get smaller in terms of their substantive value, but they're going to take longer to achieve. When I was a lawyer and I was practicing and I'd find myself in a mediation, I'd always be fascinated by the fact that in the early hours of that mediation, we would be exchanging hundreds and thousands of dollars across the table. By the end of the day, we may be only $10,000 apart, and yet it could take hours to resolve that difference that kept us from a deal. As this process plays out, it tends to take longer for concessions to come. But what's so fascinating is not only is the process and the substance predictable, but the outcome is as well. And what we know is that typically this process will end at the midpoint of the first two reasonable offers. Now, the word reasonable is really important here. If the parties are being ridiculous, probably not going to get to the middle there. But if the parties are being reasonable with each other, if they're engaged in a productive dance towards a deal, usually they're going to wind up pretty close to the midpoint of those first two reasonable numbers. And so even the ending of this is predictable. Now there are two more dynamics I want to point out to you that are really interesting. Number one is you can't short circuit this dance. It's ritualistic. There just is some psychology that is going on. If you try to just cut to the chase, if you try to just get to the middle before it's time, chances are if you come up against a really competitive negotiator, they're going to make you pay for the time that you save. The other dynamic is that the tensions between the parties, well, they tend to increase as this process progresses. And so don't be surprised at all if at the end of a competitive negotiation, you're a little fired up at the other side and they're a little fired up at you. It's why we really don't like buying a car, is because it usually involves this competitive negotiation process. It's not a process that is friendly on relationships. So those 6 or 7 things about competitive negotiations, these are things that can become great tools for you. They can become guides as you seek to manage this process in a way that is going to deliver you an outstanding deal.